How's the volume? Volume's good. Am I completely visible, Brendan, on the little thingy?
Like you're on. Yes, like maybe like a little more, just so like you get the vibe. Like
whoa, the vibe. All right. Hey, really quick before we start, let me just say a big thank you to Ferris last week. On Tuesday, I got a call that there was a family emergency. So I called up Ferris. I said, hey, I need to jump on a plane. I called him Tuesday night, and I said, you're gonna have to preach tomorrow. Just so you know, it takes about 40 hours, maybe 30 hours if you're crazy, maybe 20 hours if you're Pastor Steve, to write a good sermon. It takes a long time. And so the fact that Ferris could even get up here and preach anything and it be remotely, hey, I mean that, so really thank you for that. Yeah, sure. Yeah, you got a woo. Someone went woo. Okay, you know the drill. We gotta say hi to my mom. Hi, Mom, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Hi, Mom. That was definitely Chloe Brown. Okay. What color do you want? You know the drill. Hit me with the color. 1, 2, 3. That one was not very loud. 1, 2, 3.
yeah, you go Franklin!
That one was louder. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere in the middle. 1, 2, 3.
Disgusting. Color of water.
Someone went black. All right, don't worry. I got more markers. Whoever that was. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. All right, here we go. I really hope that this black one works. Okay, if it didn't, I'm going to have to pick those up. Wait, let me see if this works. Yeah, we're good. All right, turn to Ephesians. Turn to Ephesians 4, verses 7 through 10. Some of you are like, why are we starting right here? We haven't been in Ephesians in about over 3 months. So we need to recap some stuff. Before we recap, take a second really quick and just think about what your favorite movie is. Or one of your favorite movies. Slap it in your head. Is it there? All right, say it on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Lord of the Rings.
All right, I didn't hear anything. But here's the thing: if I asked you to summarize that movie, chances are you would not say something like, "Well, there was a beginning, and then a middle, and then an end," and that's why I just love Avengers Endgame. Or no, that is the worst way to tell a story. You would be a bad storyteller, and you wouldn't be doing justice to that story. A story needs to be told the right way. There needs to be tension, and there needs to be conflict, and there needs to be drama and build-up, and this climax and a resolution, and all of those components need to come together to form a story that is truly epic. And so far, in Ephesians 1 through 2, that is exactly what we have seen. In Ephesians 1 and 2, we have seen just that. We have seen an epic story. Put it this way, Paul tells a story. Paul tells a story. And this story does not begin with you. This story doesn't begin with me. This story doesn't begin with your parents, or your grandparents, or your great-grandparents, or your great-great-grandparents, or your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, or your great... No, I'm just kidding, all right? This is a story that begins with who? You know. It rhymes with flawed. God. This is a story that begins with God. And unlike... Here, I'll write that. This is a story that begins with God. And unlike any other story, this story begins in eternity past. That's crazy. Let me show you why that's crazy. When you and I hear stories, you know the classic trope. Once upon a Time. And there was a handsome prince. And there was a
Frog.
castle and a frog. Why not? And there's a dragon. And there's a sword. No. When the Bible opens up, Paul's story, this epic story, it begins before humans and nations. It begins before the sun and the moon and the stars, before the world even existed, before even time and space existed. God in eternity past did something. God, it rhymes with flows. Chose. Dang it, it's chose, not goes. But you're right, it does rhyme. This story begins with God. It begins with his choice, and it begins in eternity past. And God's choice was this. It was the choice to save sinners. It's a plan where sinners will be adopted into the family of God. The same sinners who rebelled against God, who hated God, who despised God, that God's kindness, that his mercy and love would be showered upon them, that they would be lavished with mercy and grace, and that God in turn would accomplish redemption. That's what his choice will lead to. It will lead to redemption, that his people, sinners, the same sinners who rebelled, that they would be set free from the slavery of sin and death. That his people would have forgiveness, that they would have wisdom, that they would become an inheritance, God's own inheritance, and that they would be sealed with the who, with the Holy Spirit, and that the Holy Spirit would become a guarantee to ensure that what God has done is set, that it's fixed, that it's secure, that it is sure, and that it can never be lost, that redemption, that salvation, that forgiveness. This story also is not just about God's choice and all that flows from that choice. This story is also about God's power. It's also about God's power and his victory. The story is also about God's power and his victory. And what we begin to see in these chapters is that God is unrivaled. Nobody even comes close. Nothing even comes close. And remember, this is a story about who? God. It's not a story about you. It's not a story about me. Do we collide with this plan? Yeah. But this is a story first and foremost about God displaying himself. And you see how God displays his power. And you see how God displays his victory, and its power and victory greater than we could ever hope for. It betrays what is possible. It goes beyond. It's the kind of power that can turn someone who is dead and make them alive. Do you remember this from Ephesians 2? Where we were talking about, because we think that we're alive. Paul says you're actually, if you're an unbeliever, you're dead. And when you read Ephesians 2, you're like, Paul, what are you talking about? Of course I'm not dead, buddy. There's blood pumping through my veins. There's breath filling these lungs. There's CO2. I'm breathing it out. I got brain waves. I'm thinking right now. I do what living people do, right? Paul goes, wrong. You think you're alive? You're actually dead. Paul says, unbelievers are dead. And if you're sitting there and you're going, you know what, honestly, I'm an unbeliever, let me be the first person to tell you that you are actually dead, spiritually dead. You go, that's not a big, look, because you're spiritually dead, that's why you physically die. You die, and then you die. And then you die again eternally. Okay? It is not double jeopardy. It's not one jeopardy. It is triple jeopardy. That's how desperate our condition is. That's how hopeless we are. And if this is the story about God saving sinners, how could he ever save somebody that's dead? Right? The dead person has no capacity. They have no ability to earn, to climb, to get out of the pit. It is completely hopeless. How could he ever save those who are entwined and live within the lusts and desires of their flesh and of their mind? Those who are by nature children of wrath. And listen to what Paul says. You don't need to turn there, just listen to this. Paul says, but God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ. By grace, you have been saved. The drama of human history. What makes this story so epic is that God intervened. That God intervened. Those who were enemies, those who were rebels, those who were far off, those who were hopeless, those who were absolutely inept and unable, Christ came down and he rescued them. And listen carefully. This was maximum intervention. This was maximum intervention. This was God stepping in all the way. Listen to what Paul says. For by what you've been saved? Grace. For by grace. God intervened. You've been saved through faith. Not that of yourselves. It is the what of God? It's the gift of God. Not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. Paul goes, hey, we did nothing. Never forget that. God did it all. Maximum intervention. This story is not only epic because God does the impossible with turning sinners into saints, but this story is also epic because God does the impossible of uniting, write that down, of uniting saints together. Of uniting saints together. And let me put it this way. In the ancient world, there were two people groups. People group 1, it rhymes with Flentiles. Gentiles. People group number 2, it rhymes with woos. There we go. Look at that. Even before I said it. All right. Look, if these guys were walking down the hallway of the ancient whatever world, and this guy sees this guy, no more smile, angry smile. Ooh, this guy sees this guy. Ooh, angry smile. What is this right here? Let me just grab my sword. I hate you. Oh, you hate me? Okay. Let me grab my sword now and let's kill each other. It's time for war. It's battle. You hate me. I hate you. Have you seen that Arthur meme where he's clenching his fist? No? Okay, I think that's an outdated
Oh,
meme.
yes, yeah.
There we go. One person. That's it. It's just constant. Ooh, just do something, buddy. I will wreck you and your family and anyone else you love. These groups do not jive together. Paul says, listen to what Paul says. This is in chapter 2:14. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into what? Think of the one scene in Avengers, where Doctor Strange does that. He makes the two groups into one body. Whoa, that's what he does. This gets canceled out. And now these groups can be so unified, they can be so together that it's as if they are just one new man. It's as if they are just one new humanity. God reconciles them into one body through the cross. It's no longer Jew versus Gentile. It's no longer Gentile versus Jew, but now it's Jews with Gentiles. Now it's Gentiles together with Jews. And they lose and they forsake their identities and they become, it begins with the C. It's a leader on staff. His name is Christian. They become Christians. They don't literally become Christian baskets. They become Christian. New identity. God makes something new. If the question is how powerful is the gospel? Just look at the church. Just look at the church. You have all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of walks of life, different cultural, different social, different economic. They come together under one banner, the banner of Christ, as you guessed it, Christians. That is God's power. that is God's victory. It's not just in the big picture. It's not in the big picture of what he does through human history. It's even in the small picture. It's even within the church, and even within every single person within the church. It's total and complete and absolute victory. That is God's power. That is God's victory. Put it this way, the church is a temple. The church is a temple. It is a taste of the Garden of Eden. It's the testimony of what God's done, of what God's doing, and what he will continue to do. And that what he will continue to do will be powerful, that it will be victorious, and that he'll finish the job in the end by turning the world into a new and even better Garden of Eden, and the church becomes a sample of that. The church becomes a taste that God will finish the job in the end. That's the nature of the church. And I don't say this to be rude. If you think that the church is just a building, you actually know nothing about the church. For real. You don't know anything. If you think that it's just, there's some walls, and we do some games, and there's markers, and then you sing, and you just do it to do it, and then there's this wood over there, and there's some steel beams. Look, this isn't just a story. This is a story that shapes everything, okay? This is a story that shapes everything. And the church is at the center of that right now. Believers are at the center of that right now. This is so much bigger than you and me, okay? This is big time. This is big ticket. And as we come to Ephesians 3, something that we see is that, is this story grand and epic? Yes. Did God choose? Yes. Did all these things flow from God's choice, like salvation and forgiveness? Is God's power and victory on display through the big picture, through the small picture, through the church, through people coming together, Jews and Gentiles? Yes. But now Paul does something interesting, and Paul turns to himself. P for Paul. Paul turns to himself and he says, this story, yes, it's all these things, but Paul says, it's all these things, and it changed everything about my life. Paul says, this story is all these things, and it changed everything about my life. Radically. Look really quick in Ephesians 3. Because we're going to see now, and Paul will tell us in Ephesians chapter 3, how this story took his world and flipped it upside down. He says, nothing was ever the same after I heard this story. What does he call himself in chapter 3, verse 1? For this reason, I, Paul, the what? The prisoner. Paul goes, you want to know how much I believe this? You want to know how important this is, how precious this is? Paul goes, I went all the way. I'm in jail. Before, I was throwing Christians in jail. And now I'm one of the Christians in jail. All right, we switched places. Paul goes, I believe this story so much that right now I'm suffering. And Paul goes, I'll go to the end for Christ. You can put me in shackles. You can put me in chains. But I will go all the way. Not only is Paul a prisoner, Paul says this story also gives him perspective. This story in chapter 3 also, he says, gives him perspective. He uses one word, very fascinating word. He says, it begins with an M. Do you remember? Blistery. Mystery. He says, this is a mystery. He goes, hey, this was something that was hidden. It was hidden. You couldn't know it in the past. But then, like a choice arrow, God unquivered some of these events, and he notched it back, and then he let the arrow go, and now everyone can see the arrow flying, the choice arrow. This is bigger than you and me. People from long ago were looking, peering to see what would happen. And Paul says, look no further. Those things are happening right now in ways that we could never even fathom, ways that weren't even on the table. That's the nature of mystery. It was concealed, but now it's revealed. It's bigger than you and I. That is my perspective now. It not only changes his perspective, it changes also his mindset. This story of Ephesians 1 and 2 also changes Paul's mindset. And we also see that in chapter 3. Paul says things like he feels unworthy. And you can read chapter 3. Go back and read it for yourself. You can really feel the humility as he's talking. And not just that he's unworthy, not just that there's humility, but he really does feel privilege. He goes, man. And you go, privilege? Have you lost your brain? You're starving to death. You're cold. You're in jail. Paul goes, I'm so privileged because guess what story I get to be a part of? This story. I get to do that which is actually eternal, that which matters, that which makes an impact. Paul goes, I don't deserve any of this. You can hear his mindset. Not only do you see that he's a prisoner, you not only see his perspective and his mindset, you also see his mission in chapter 3. You also see his mission in chapter 3. And we've already touched on this. He was a murderer, and now he's a what? Missionary. And his goal is to preach the unfathomable, I don't know if I pronounced that right, the unsearchable riches of Christ. Paul goes, you know what I'm all about? I'm all about Christ now. That is my mission. To take the good news of what Jesus Christ did and his victory over sin and death, his death on the cross and the resurrection, and now I need to tell everybody. If I'm in jail, if I'm out of jail, it doesn't matter. If they throw me back in jail, which they later will do, Paul says it doesn't matter. That is the mission now. Not only do you see him as a prisoner, his perspective, his mindset, his mission, you also get to see Paul as a pastor now. And that's what you see at the very end of chapter 3, where Paul just falls on his knees and he prays. And he begins praying for the saints in Ephesus. And I would encourage you, go back and read chapter 3, verses 14 to 21. Go back and read chapter 3, verses 14 to 21. One of the most beautiful and epic prayers in the entire Bible. You want to learn something about prayer, then you want to read the end of Ephesians chapter 3. Paul says, man, I pray that you are strengthened by the Spirit, that you're close to Christ, that you're anchored in love, that you have complete confidence in God. I mean, go back and read this prayer. Really incredible. And so let me just recap, all right? It's been 3 months. Let me just recap with this. This is the story that begins with God in eternity past, with God's choice and his power and his victory over sin and death through his Son. It's the unveiling of a great mystery that was hidden in ages past of Gentiles coming together with Jews as fellow heirs, as what? Say it with me, 1, 2, 3. As Christians. That was the weakest one ever. And they come together and they form the church. They form a new humanity. They form something special, something unique. They form a holy temple. This story changed everything for the Apostle Paul. But now, in Ephesians 4 through 6, Paul does something very interesting. And you would kind of expect it. Paul goes, this story changed me, but now has the story changed you? Now, Paul points the finger and says, look, you've seen how it impacted my life. I went all the way, but now will you? You've seen my life change from top to bottom, internal, external, everything, you name it. Now will this story collide with your life? It's not just enough that it affected Paul. He's an apostle. He saw a vision. He's an author of scripture. But now, does it affect, does it impact, does it collide with your life? And maybe you go, help me, okay? Help me learn how to live in a way that exemplifies, that makes much, and intensifies, magnifies these truths in my life. And Paul goes, great question. Let me show you how to begin living out these things. And Ephesians 4 begins revolving around a few key words. The first key word is walk. And that's what we've seen at the beginning of chapter 4. That's what we've seen in the beginning of chapter 4. Paul says, walk what? Walk how? Look at chapter 4. You tell me. It's not a trick question. And I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called. You know what the calling is, all right? We've talked about all of that, how God chose and brings his own close to himself, and you need to now live in a way that proves that shows that demonstrates that. And you go, how do I walk worthy then? Paul goes, how about you start with humility? That we remember, hey, we're not the main character. In the beginning, God's the main character. This story begins with who? God and his choice. It's about his power and his victory. And so remember, hey, we're just a little guy. We're just a little lady, right? if you're the main character, you are the furthest thing from a humble person. Paul goes, then you're not actually walking worthy. And he doesn't just mention humility, he also mentions gentleness, that you are a gentle person, that you're a patient person. Do you remember patience with the long nose, right? And your nose needs to be really, quote unquote, long. It takes you a long time to get angry. Paul goes, hey, if you want to walk worthy, you need to be patient. And not just patient, but that you bear one another. That you go out of your way. Is that guy a butthead? You go out of your way to take care of them, to love them, to serve them, okay? Paul goes, you bear one another, even if they're difficult, in love, with love. That is the first key word. The second key word is this: unity. And this word, man, you really need to understand this. You write that down, circle it, star it, box it, put a star by it. Look, Paul talking about unity in chapter 4 should not be a surprise. You should expect him to talk about the issue of unity because the church is a what? Rhymes with flemple. The church is a temple, and Jesus is the cornerstone, and the apostles and prophets are the foundation, and the whole building is being what? Being fitted together. Good job, one person. The whole building is being fitted together. Do you hear the metaphor? Fitted together. That sounds like what word? Unity. There we go. When believers come together in unity, it's beautiful because it shows that God is working, that God has won, and that Ephesians 1 and 2 is true. When the church comes together, you show that God's done something great. He's done something great in your life, so much so that now you can interact with that person in the right type of way. Let me put a sidebar really quick. Some of y'all are real petty. Okay? Some of y'all are really, really petty. And maybe a girl, she says something mean to you, and it was like a year ago. And you've never forgotten. You chuckle, right? But it's like, that's the furthest thing from unity. And I'm just never gonna talk to her again. All right? And it's like, I can't believe she said that. That's all. What are we talking about here? What are we doing? Look, if you're not going out of your way to reconcile, to apologize, to seek for forgiveness, to make things right, then you are not coming together and being fitted together as a holy temple, but you're doing the opposite. You're creating disunity. But if you do that, then you're proclaiming that you don't care about any of this kind of stuff. Do you see why unity is so important? It is integral to being a Christian. Because when you come together and you put, you let bygones be bygones, or you put it on the shelf, or you go out of your way to make it right, then you show, hey, God did something in my life, and now I want to make it right. And I care about unity, and I care because the church actually is a holy temple. And look, at the end of chapter verse 6 or something, or verse 5, Paul says there's one body, there's one Spirit, there's one hope, there's one God, there's one baptism, one faith, one Lord, one God and Father. Paul goes, look at all of the stuff that unites us together. If you're a believer, it's everything. Everything unites us together. We're not worshiping different gods here as Christians. We don't read different books here as Christians. We don't have different faiths as Christians. We don't have different kinds of baptism. It's one unity. Paul goes, are you unified? And as we come to our third key word, it's this: spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts. This is the third key word, and you're like, where did this come from? Is this coming out of nowhere? Look, Paul says, if you want to walk worthy, then you need to be unified. And now you can get the logic. If you want to be unified, then you have to know something about spiritual gifts, okay? This idea, this concept, this topic is integral to being unified and being unified well. So Paul opens up a new tab on Internet Explorer, and he types in spiritual gifts. And the question is this. We'll answer this question for the remainder of our time. What is a spiritual gift? What is a spiritual gift? How much time do we have?
4 minutes.
Yikes, we're gonna go over by like a little bit. That's all right. What is turn to Psalm 68. You're like, are you sure? Yeah. Turn to Psalm 68. Really quick, really quick. If you do not understand Psalm 68, you cannot understand spiritual gifts really. You really got to get Psalm 68. Okay, is everybody there? Okay, this is big time. This is very important. Look at how this opens up for the choir director, a psalm of David, a psalm. Look at what David says. Let God arise. Here's God. He's in heaven. Obviously. That's where he hangs out. That's his abode. He's seated. He's smiling. And then he arises. Why does God get up? He gets up to go to what? For what? For war. In Psalm 68, David says, God is seated. And then he stands up. And he stands up for battle. And look at verse 1. Let his enemies be what? Scattered. Let those who hate him what? Flee before him as smoke is driven away. So drive them away. I love this. As wax melts before fire, so let the wicked perish before God. David says, God, rise. Go up, stand up, go to battle. And in the same way that does fire melt a candle? Yes, okay. How easily does fire melt a candle?
Easily.
Very easily. David goes, in the same way that fire melts a candle and the wax comes down, do that to your enemies. Where it's easy, where it's effortless, where it's just, of course you will do that. Wreck them, destroy them. Go to battle, have victory, and show your show your power. That's what David wants. Ooh, some very important parallels. Okay. Look at verse 4. Still Psalm 68. David says, sing to God, sing praises to his name. Lift up a song for him who rides through the desert, whose name is the Lord, and exalt before him. David goes, two groups of people. Group number A, group letter A. The first group, enemies, destroy them. The second group, look at that victory. Look at what God has done and praise and sing and exalt and be glad that God has showed you his power and his victory and he's taking care of his people. Look at verse 18. Look at verse 18. David says, Psalm 68 verse 18, you have ascended on high. You have led captive your captives. You have, what does it say there? You have what? This is very important. You really got to get this. You have received, get this. You have received, write that down, underline that, circle that. You have received. Why is he talking about the word received so much? It'll make sense in a second. You have received gifts among men, even among the rebellious also, that the Lord God may dwell there. David says, God, you went to war, you showed your victory, you had power, you came down. Here's earth, all right? You came down, you had victory, and when you had victory, you received gifts. These gifts are spoils of what? War. Very good. You guys get that? Write that down. These gifts are spoils of war. These gifts are spoils of war. These gifts are spoils of war. You know how spoils of war work. You have this nation. Where's my markers? You got two nations right here. Look at these babies. Yeah. Nation blue, nation green. Which one do you want to win?
Green! Go friendly!
Green conquers this nation. Now everything of the blue nation belongs to who?
The
The green nation. Is the green nation allowed to take everything?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
Because it was.
Because they conquered. Whatever they take is now the green nation's what?
Spoil.
Spoil of war. They are the legal owner of that stuff. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, great. Military language. The spoil of war, write this down, becomes the reminder that that person won. The spoil of war becomes the reminder that that person won. You have received gifts among men. Go back to Ephesians 4. Really quick. Really quick. Are we going to end on time? Don't worry. Don't worry. Received. Why the time? Look at verse 7. Ephesians 4, verse 7. It took a minute, but we're finally going to get to our text. I've done all the setup. We're going to speed through it. There was a strategy here. Look at verse 7. But to each one of us grace was given according to the measure of whose gift? Of Christ's gift. Why? Okay, don't break my heart. Why does Christ have gifts? Because he conquered sin and death. Now do you understand? Christ has gifts because those gifts are his spoil of war. In Ephesians 1 and 2, you see Christ's power over sin and death. We were dead, but we were made alive. We were sinners, but now we're saints. The two become one. A temple, the Garden of Eden. Christians, you see Christ's ability to conquer. And that's why Christ has gifts. Gifts. Okay? Christ's gifts. Now, look at verse 8. Therefore it says, this is why we did Psalm 68, because these next verses sound like what? Psalm 68. Good job, one person. Verse 8. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, and he, what word would you expect to see?
Gave.
No. What word would you expect to see? Someone said it. Received. That's not what Paul says. He says what? He gave. He gave gifts to men. Do you see what Paul just did here? This is what Paul did. Paul goes, step 1, Psalm 68. God comes down. He conquers. He shows his power. He shows his victory. And then he receives what? The spoils of war. And then he ascends back up and shows he's not just powerful and victorious over the world, but he's also powerful and victorious over everything. That was step 1. That was Psalm 68. Paul says now, step 2, he not only receives the gifts, but now, step 2, in this verse, now he does what with those gifts? He gives. Do you guys see why there's the change? Step 1, receive it. I conquered. Step 2, now you get them if you're a Christian. Now you get one of those spiritual gifts. And that spiritual gift is a spoil of war. Is a spoil of war. When you do your spiritual gift in church, whatever it is, you are showing, you are living your life as if you are a trophy. You're living your life as if you are a trophy. You demonstrate Ephesians 1 and 2. You demonstrate Psalm 68, and you demonstrate that it's all true. You demonstrate that it's all true. And you're like, are you sure? Yeah. Look at verse 9. Now this expression, he ascended, what does it mean except that he also had descended into the lower parts? Nerdy Bible translation time, it should say he also descended into the lower parts, namely the what? Namely the earth. It's not saying that Jesus descended into hell or anything weird like that. Okay? And we know that because in Psalm 68, where did God descend to?
Earth.
The earth. And then where did he ascend to?
The heavens.
Heavens. Okay, so they're parallel. They're the same type of idea here. Verse 10, he who descended is himself also who ascended far above all the heavens, so that he might fill all things. Paul goes, it's Psalm 68, but even greater than we could ever imagine. God descended, he had victory, he received gifts, God ascended, and then he gives those gifts to men. Okay? That is what a spiritual gift is. It is a spoil of war. Why are we given these gifts to begin with? Are we trophies? Yes. Or do we proclaim that God did something great? Yes. But we also do these things. It's not just what is a spiritual gift, but what must your spiritual gift promote? It rhymes with fluidity. Unity. You must use it for this now. Do you guys see why serving the church is so important? Yeah, because it proclaims a lot of stuff. Let me just encourage you right now. If you're a high schooler, really consider student leadership. Really consider serving this body right here, so that you can promote unity, so that you can walk worthy, so that you can show, hey, God has changed my life, not just Paul's life, but also my life, and so that you can display to the rest of the youth group that this is an epic story, that God has chose, that God did choose you, that you are now forgiven and saved and redeemed, and you become an inheritance, and that God has had power and victory in your life and over your life.